Hello, my name is John Aaron. I'm a teacher at New York Insight, and I've been fortunate to be part of the New York Insight community since 2001. I'm speaking to you today from our home in Harlem, so it's likely you'll hear some urban sounds which make up the soundscape here. And I'm happy to be with you to share some thoughts on the theme of finding joy in uncertainty. While the state of the world has never not been uncertain, these days there's an acute awareness that much of what people may have counted on in the past will be different or simply not there. Systems that we've grown accustomed to, like clean water, predictable weather, or a stable food supply, many of these may not be around much longer, or at least not in the same way. And the more we are tuned in to this level of uncertainty and to the collapse of ecosystems and societal structures, the more fear and anxiety we might be experiencing, often leading to paralysis or worse, unskillful actions. Now, I don't intend with this talk to go into the details of what this collapse might look like. There's ample resources for this. Rather, I would like to speak to how we can bring our Dharma and meditation practice to the experience of uncertainty in a way which will lead to what is often spoken of as an appropriate response. Part of that appropriate response arises from joy, and part of the response is joy, which may sound rather surprising to bring up in the context of climate collapse and the rise of authoritarianism, etc. The real question for me is, how can joy support our turning towards suffering, our own and that of others? So we'll look at this from four ways. One is bringing joy to the uncertainty within our own meditation practice. Then how we bring joy to what I would call the uncertainty of the certainties of old age, sickness, and death. And how we bring joy to every moment of our daily lives and the uncertainties of that. And then how we integrate this joy into facing the drastic changes that we know will be coming. So first, the truth. I recognize that I'm approaching this from an immense place of privilege. I'm a white, middle-class, cis, heterosexual man in the United States, in a world which privileges people in my social location. And I want to be clear that when I'm talking about joy within uncertainty, I'm not saying that it's somehow okay or a spiritual opportunity to live with food insecurity or to not know if you'll be evicted at the end of the month. The Buddha in his time was quite clear about the basic prerequisites for practice, namely food, shelter, clothing, and healthcare. Living hand to mouth to survive or scrambling every night to find a place to live is hell. There is nothing liberative or spiritually glamorous about that. That kind of uncertainty is not what I'm talking about. When the Buddha spoke of renunciation as a choice, this is not what he had in mind. The Buddha's vision is for all beings to be cared for in their basic needs and to be free. In my talk, I intend to address more existential facts of death, old age, and illness, and what it means to move through a collapsing world when your social privilege can't protect you anymore. Some of us are more trained than others in that because the world was never not collapsed for the most marginalized. But in my case, this is a big shift. My privilege will not protect me, or at least not much. My home might flood or burn. My savings might evaporate in a banking crisis. And it might not be safe to even take a deep breath, given the rising pollution that the fire season is causing. This level of system collapse is not something the Buddha experienced in his lifetime. Of course, there were societal issues, and he found his way in the midst of many conflicts, but nothing that is comparable in scale. and that might ultimately compromise life on earth as we know it. But what he did teach can support us to face into this moment and with joy. So let's get started. What do I mean by joy? And what do I mean by uncertainty? Joy has numerous contexts in Buddhism. It's an awakening factor. There's resonant joy, mudita. It's a jhana factor, starting with its first mention in the Anapanasati Sutta. And with the exception of joy as a jhana factor, joy can arise as both a worldly link to conditions and an unworldly feeling. In both cases, I think joy is really a physical experience. It's a physical response. There is an excitement and an exhilaration. And while, of course, there will be thoughts associated with this response, these are secondary. One quality that's mentioned for the Buddha is sugato, which is often translated as one who is fulfilled, joyful, and truly well. Now, what do I mean by uncertainty? In this context, I'm actually combining dukkha, suffering, and anicca, impermanence. The suffering caused by nothing being fixed and the impermanent nature of all conditioned things. There are, of course, certain things that are certain. These are found in the 5 Buddha's reflections. We will grow old, we will become ill, and we will die, etc. But we don't know how that will play out. And I'll come back to these in a later segment of these talks. For now, though, I'd like to explore finding joy in the uncertainty of our formal practice. I don't know about you, but for me, when I first came to meditation, I was anxious, I was excited, there was a great deal of anticipation, and I was just looking forward to those first instructions. And probably for the first few minutes of practice, as I came to my breath, as the mind briefly settled, I did feel a bit of joy. But then, of course, the mind went back to its normal ways, and as the Dhammapada says, was thrashing about like a fish out of water. And that joy, of course, dissipated almost immediately, and the questioning came up, what was I doing wrong? This can't be right. And then I went into doubt and all sorts of proliferation. I'm sure this is familiar to many of you, and having taught for many years, I know it's a common theme that we bring an expectation and an excitement into our practice, and we want it to be a particular way. The mind had a fixed idea of what it should be like, certainty. And at some point, there's a shift. And of course, we start to realize the first teaching of the Buddha that all conditioned things are impermanent. And once we see this with wisdom, we can turn away from that suffering. So we immediately confront the impermanence of our own mind, the uncertainty of our own mind. And of course, it's through our formal practice that we start to work with this. And as I explain to students, almost in the first of any class, whatever we experience in meditation, we experience elsewhere in our lives. And that's really the beauty of formal practice. We get to create a safe space in which we can experiment and we can start to see our mind's habits without acting from those habits. And we start to realize that as we practice, these habits can change. So we learn to drop expectations and be open to experience. Now, of course, obstacles get in the way. And they're the common obstacles of sloth and torpor and agitation and worry, sense desire, aversion, etc. Doubt, of course. But what I'm talking about actually precedes that, which is the obstacle of the attitude we bring into practice. And can we bring to practice this joyousness of jumping into the unknown, And can that joy that we bring to practice create more curiosity and allow those sparks to keep the joy coming? So we learn to be with the unexpected. We continually wake up to these surprises. We jump into the don't know mind, not with trepidation, but with excitement. Now, of course, some people are coming to practice already in physical pain or emotional pain, of course, or as they're sitting, the emotional pain and the physical pain can arise. So how do we find joy here? This is certainly more challenging, but it's the same curiosity, right? It's the same investigative function of mindfulness. And if we hark back to the awakening factors, investigation itself leads to energy and joy. So we investigate the physical pain, for instance, right? We bring curiosity to it, and we start to discover that between those sensations that we are naming as pain, there are other sensations which are not necessarily in pain. And we find joy in that discovery. We can also start to see that our whole body's not in pain and that we can transition, we can pendulate back and forth between those parts of the body which are calm and resilient and those parts of the body that may be in pain. And we can do the same thing with emotional pain, right? We start to realize the emotion is experienced in the body, and then we find parts of the body that are not having that same experience, and we can pendulate back and forth and observe that change. So again, in those moments, we can find a certain joy in the uncertainty and in the constantly changing nature of this. And of course, we can start simply by finding the joy in each breath, right? That we receive each breath with gratitude. We receive each breath with an opportunity. Oh, here I am, another moment to be fully present. And then we start to see the contrast between conditional joy and unconditional joy. So urban life presents interesting opportunities for this because, we can be sitting in a peaceful meditation hall, or perhaps in our home, we found a place that's peaceful and calm, and we settle into practice. The conditions are perfect. And then a car goes honking by. Right? Now, initially, of course, we may be jolted by that. Right? But as we practice, the car honking by just becomes another experience. And in those moments, we're actually experiencing unconditional joy, a joy that's not linked to any particular environment, but we can be fully present with whatever is being experienced. All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. Like a fish pulled from the sea and cast upon the shore, this mind thrashes about, trying to throw off Mara's sway. Hard to hold back, flighty, alighting where it will. It's good to tame the mind. A tamed mind leads to bliss. So, of course, our formal practice is a practice of taming the mind. And in those moments where the mind is in fact tamed, joy arises. It's like, this is the joy the Buddha was talking about. This is the joy in practice. This is the joy of being with uncertainty from a place of surprise and not knowing. And rather than stepping back from that, we dive into it. And there's so many opportunities to practice this in our formal practice. And as we'll see, as we discover those moments, we then bring that to all the other areas of our lives. So when we come back for our next section, I'll be talking about finding joy in the uncertainty of the certainties of old age, sickness, and death. I hope you'll join me.